Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. If you are looking for vendor process training for you or your entire vendor team, head over to my site at deborah.richardson.com and click on the Vendor Team Training Solved button to learn more about what is included in the monthly or annual plan and also to download a 2021 training schedule. Get the training that you and your team needs to avoid payment fraud, duplicate vendors, compliance fines, and more. In this episode, I found an audit of 10 government entities on the vendor management practices, and wow, I want to talk about their findings that include common issues that your organization may be dealing with. So if you want to hear what they found and best practices that you could implement to avoid those findings, keep listening. Welcome to episode 143, Tales from an Audit, Findings for Management of the Vendor Master File and Best Practices to Avoid. An audit report was published on March 2019 from the Office of the Auditor General Western Australia organization. And I thought it was interesting because even though it was across the world for me, I am in the U.S., smack dab in the middle in Oklahoma. That report showed that organizations still have the same management deficiencies in their vendor master file, no matter where they are. While the report included 5 state and 5 local government entities and included multiple relevant sections, the section on management of the vendor master file for me was most relevant. So I'm going to focus on that for this podcast episode. And so we're going to look at 3 different findings and then also a best practice that you can implement for free today to avoid. So let's look at the most, they're finding that said most entities need to improve the management of their supplier master files. And let's just take a moment. So they call it supplier, I call it vendor, same thing. But does that resonate with you? It resonated with me as a practitioner because, of course, the processing of invoices and the approval of those invoices and the payment of those invoices were always a priority over managing the vendor master file. Even the creation of the purchase order was kind of took precedent because once the sourcing or purchasing team found the vendor and they needed to get a purchase order, you have to get a vendor master file created in order to create that purchase order. And so that step in that whole P2P process was often thought to be a bit, not necessarily rushed, but they didn't think that, or it wasn't assumed that there was much that needed to be done. So you just go ahead and hurry up and set up a vendor master file. And as we know, that is definitely not the case, not in today's world with fraudulent vendors. And so hopefully this was 2019, and with the pandemic probably made it a lot worse because you definitely didn't have time to clean up or manage the supplier master files or vendor master files. But so that being said, this probably really resonates with you. Now, for them, the purpose of their review was to determine if the vendor master files were well managed and that their operations promoted effective accounts payable processes that reduced fraud and errors. Now, again, what they found were common issues, but they were also issues that can be resolved with best practices in management of the vendor master file. So here are 3 things that they found, and for each I have a best practice to avoid. Now, the first one is 6 of the 10 entities had a significant number of vendor records that had missing information. Can you resonate with that? Do you already know that you have missing information in your vendor master file? So email addresses, tax IDs, telephone numbers, contacts. Do you already know that that information is missing? One best practice is to identify what vendor information and the supporting documents for that vendor information. For example, you would require a tax ID, and the supporting documentation would be a W-9, and I'm talking for U.S. vendors. So identify what information and what supporting documents are required at vendor setup and when updating vendor information, and make no exceptions. Be sure to require the vendor email address and telephone number, because those are the ways that you communicate with your vendor. If you want to get that missing information or any missing information or information that's no longer valid when you go to validate during a recurring vendor master file cleanup process that hopefully you have. And it's also, what you use when you want to confirm any future changes that they make on their account. For example, a bank account change. So make sure you require that information at the start, document it, put it in your vendor policy, have leadership sign off on it, and then make sure it's in your desktop procedures so all your vendor team or any of your accounts payable team members that onboard vendors or make changes to the vendor master file, they know what to require. So that was the first one, is that vendor records had missing information. The second one was that 7 of the 10 entities had a significant number of active vendor records that had not been used in 2 or more years. And this, quite frankly, is another result of just not having time to clean the vendor master file, or that time to manage your vendor master file. And so a best practice is to inactivate vendors that have not had invoice activity, purchase order activity, payment activity, or even vendor record activity, because if they just submitted documentation and went through your whole process to update their vendor master file, that is actually the whole point of the vendor master file cleanup and inactivating your vendors, is so that you can get that updated information and keep that information on file and make sure it's always accurate. And so you look at those 4 things, and if they have not had activity in any of those 4 things in 15, 18, or 24 months, whatever is best for your company. This audit recommended 24 months, but again, it's whatever's best for your company. Now, if once you inactivate those vendors, if those vendors want to do business with your company in the future, you want to treat them as new vendors, so you collect new supporting documents. And this is the way you keep that vendor information up to date in your vendor master file. And a couple of points that they also made was that a lot of the information was inaccurate. The banking information was inaccurate. And so that having that information just sit in your vendor master file without rechecking it on a recurring basis, without following up with the vendor to update it, and then without inactivating those records if there's been no update in that 15, 18, or 24 months, really results in just bad bad information, and they did document that. So think about that in your vendor master file. When's the last time you've inactivated vendor records based on activity? And I will say that if it's been over a year, over 2 years, you're probably going to look at up to a 50% reduction in your active vendors if you have not done it in a few years, and if you go ahead and do that. And keep in mind, a great benefit of that is once you inactivate those vendors, how many ever percentage of those vendors you inactivated, those vendor records can no longer be susceptible to fraud, either internal or external, because you've inactivated them. Now, I know a lot of folks don't like the whole inactivation piece, because once you inactivate vendor records, some other department is going to have a fit, right? And so what I would say to that is, one, just verify that you have segmented your vendors. So if you have a set of vendors that's in your vendor master file that's used for, I don't know, a bidding process that purchasing or sourcing uses, and they're not necessarily, you haven't done business with them because they haven't been selected yet, but yet they're in your vendor master file, so that they would be able to access this one module of your accounting system or ERP that allows them to bid. Put them in a whole separate vendor type or account category, so that you exclude them from your inactivation process. So make sure you do that piece, and then you'll be less susceptible to inactivate vendors that might be used for something different than accounts payable payments. All right, the third finding was that 6 of the 10 entities had duplicate vendors, and many were due to routine updates to vendor information that resulted in new vendor files. So that's a direct result of not searching and finding duplicate vendors in your vendor master file before you either update a vendor or add a new vendor. Because in some cases you think it's a new vendor add, and it's really an updated or an existing vendor change. Because remember, the vendor doesn't know, and sometimes the internal team member doesn't know either, our verbiage, what we consider a new vendor, whether or not we add a new vendor, or versus adding a new remit address or a new location, depending on your accounting system or ERP. It really could be a new vendor, even though it may have a relationship to an existing vendor in a system like SAP, or if it's just a new address or a new location in a system like PeopleSoft or Oracle, where it's just a new site ID. So they don't really know our processes, and so you can't rely on what the vendor or the internal team member tell us we need to do. We have to make sure that the vendor team is aware and knows what documented process needs to be followed when those vendor requests comes in. But one of the best practices that I think is the best practice, one of the better best practices for this particular issue of duplicate vendors, and is really your first defense against duplicate vendors, is that for all vendor requests, even if they indicate it is a new vendor setup, require a search of the vendor master file by 3 things: by legal name, by tax ID, and by address, in order to find duplicates. Because by legal name, if you don't have a vendor naming convention, or if you have one, but you had vendor, you inherited a vendor master file, you don't know what kind of process they had, or vendor legal naming convention they had when you inherited that vendor master file. You could have vendors in there by a different vendor legal name convention, or none at all, and it was just put in how that particular vendor team member wanted to put it in. And so you might not be able to find it by legal name, but you might be able to find it by tax ID. But if you can't find it by legal name because they put it in a different way, or by tax ID because maybe they didn't enter in the tax ID and that information is missing, like the first issue that they found or the first finding that they found, then you can check it by address. And so if you search by each of those three, you know what the wild cards are. You'll be most likely to find duplicates by searching those three versus only searching one way, legal name or tax ID, or for that matter, not doing a duplicate search at all. And I know that can happen. So make sure you put that duplicate search in and make sure they're searching by legal name, tax ID, and address. All right, so my question to you, and I asked this first also, is can you resonate with these findings? And if you can, and if you want more best practices, I do have a free webinar. It's an on-demand recording. It is on YouTube, and so you can jump around. I have timestamps, and you can kind of jump around the hour-long webinar to go to the section that you want to go to. But the webinar is called The Top 10 Best Practices for Your Vendor Master File to Avoid Fraud, Fines, and Bad Vendor Data. So I will have a link to that in the blog post that accompanies this podcast episode. And in that blog post will be a link to that free webinar so you can watch that at your convenience. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 143rd episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.